Good evening. This is Redwood Wonk. My name is Eric Kirk. I'm with Dave Frank. We are discussing national news of the day, mostly the fallout of yesterday's election. The red wave was reduced to a red ripple. It did, in fact, the Republicans did, in fact, make gains, and we will talk about that, but nowhere near on the scale that they ought to have. A lot of blame, a lot of finger pointing going down, going back and forth. But I actually believe that the primary factor is what we'll discuss in our second segment, a factor that has well, it does have to do with the Republicans, but we'll talk about when we get there. But also a lot of blame for Donald Trump for basically pushing bad candidates, bad Senate candidates, but also on a number of other factors, and especially election denial. But basically, what's happened is that it's come down to the Republicans will probably take the House. There are a lot of House races that have not been decided yet, but the Republicans have 15 pickups. That is 15 flips from Democrat to Republican seats. So far, the Democrats only have 4 flips. More to come, but it does look like the Republicans will take the House, but nowhere near the 50 or 60, changeover sweep that was some people were expecting, that some of the polls were showing, and that some of the people were projecting. And nowhere near what should be expected for a first midterm election following a Democrat winning the presidency. So a lot to say there. Also in the Senate, we don't know who is going to be running the Senate when it's done. It's come down to 3 seats. 3 seats, 3 states. Georgia, which looks like it's headed to a runoff. CNN is projecting that it's headed to a runoff because in Georgia, one candidate needs to have 50% or more of the votes in order to win. There was a Libertarian candidate that got a little over 2% of the vote. Warnock was about a percentage point ahead of Walker, and with about 49.4%, I believe was the last count that I saw. But it's not likely to pass 50%. Not everybody has projected it yet, but CNN has. I think a couple other networks have. The other 2 houses that are, the other 2 states that are still open are Arizona, the Democrat Kelly against the Republican Masters. The polls had shown it very close. I guess it's supposed to be close. I am not completely understanding why this race hasn't been called, because I'm looking at the votes that have not yet been counted. If you go to CNN or the New York Times, they have a breakdown of county by county as to how many of the votes have come in and how they're voting. And basically, the counties that are the bluest, the 2 counties, Maricopa and Pima, which has Tucson, anyway, they are the heaviest blue counties, and they've got a lot of votes left to be counted. The red counties don't have as many. So I'm not sure. And right now, Kelly is 5 points ahead. So I don't understand why that one hasn't been called, but networks tend to be very cautious about these things. And then Nevada Cortez Mastro is a couple points behind, but a lot of votes still to be counted in the Las Vegas area, which is where she is. Cortez Mastro, do I have that name right? Where she is still behind Laxalt, the Republican. Pardon me, she's ahead in Las Vegas, and a lot of votes to be counted there. Will there be enough votes for her to catch up? We don't know. So those are the 3 states. The big news was that Fetterman, despite his stroke and a very poor debate performance, flipped Pennsylvania, which has made it very difficult for the Republicans to retake the Senate. It's set up this situation. He defeated Dr. Oz and will be the next senator. Hopefully he recovers by that time. A lot of questions about that. Dave, you want to jump in?
Yeah, sure. This is a really interesting time, I would say, because each election is sort of its own unique set of circumstances, but we all are always trying to create an overarching theme. And so for this segment, like you said, the overarching theme was that there was not an anticipated wave. So as we talked about during the coverage, there's a headwind always against the sitting president in the midterm cycle that follows 2 years after the presidential election cycle. And so typically it'd be like a 30 to 60 seat swing that can be expected. And in this instance, with the fundamentals the way they are, there was every reason to believe that, or at least you could make the argument that there's every reason to believe that that's what would happen again. But in fact, that's not what we've seen, and not even close. So it's only the morning after, or so to speak, one day after. So despite the scenario, on the ground, what we're seeing is, like, I think one of the big takeaways is that the House is most likely going to shift control. It's not fully hashed out yet with the final tally, but there's an estimate that it'd be 222 seats go to ultimately to the Republicans, which surpasses the 218 they need to control it. So that's one thing that we sort of think we could, definitively say. But when it comes to the Senate, it really very well may come down to Nevada and Georgia. You said Arizona too, but I think I agree with you that Arizona seems like it's already fairly certain, not certain, but you could make an educated guess on how that's going to go. And so in theory, this might actually just go down to that runoff in Georgia again, like it did last time. We're likely to get a 50-50 Senate, although some people are saying that Nevada could go the direction of the Democrats, but we'll see how this plays out. But so if there is an overarching theme of what did not go well for the GOP to the Republicans, to explain how they came up this short with maybe a net gain of about 12 seats in the House and arguably maybe even no net gain at all in the Senate, what went wrong?
And almost lost Wisconsin, almost lost North Carolina. I mean, it could have been worse for them.
Yeah, and actually, if you look at there's a graphic that I've seen before where it shows county by county how the results played out. So obviously we're talking about the Senate here and the House, but there's obviously there was state elections, there were local elections, and people have been tending over time to not cross party lines when they vote for a high level on the ticket versus a low level on the ticket. There's been an increased polarization. So typically people, for example, if you support Joe Biden, if you consider yourself a Democrat, you're typically not going to vote for a Republican in state races or local races. That polarization trend has been ongoing. But we did see some split tickets. And so what would explain those split tickets? And what I think one of the narratives that is starting to get some traction here, and we'll hash it out a little bit later, but it's worth mentioning that people that supported Trump under the broad category of election denial, and you could argue who that is exactly, but there's people that track it out there. It's not, we don't need to project on people who they are. But in fact, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Democrats did really well against those people who campaigned on overhauling elections. But down ticket also. So Democrat candidates for Secretary of State beat far right opponents in Michigan, New Mexico, Minnesota. So it's not just the effect on the balance in the Senate that Trump had. It's really across the board. We are seeing the appearance that there's a fatigue. There's a fatigue in the election denial. But also this one last thing here, Eric. There's like I'll talk about it a little bit more. But there's a candidate from the 3rd district in Colorado, he's running against Boebert. His name's Adam Frisch, and I heard him say, yeah, it's really close. He only leads by 70 votes, but Boebert is the incumbent Republican Congress member. And what he campaigned on is that he felt in his district, by the way, that district is, I think he said, about a third Republican, about 20% Democrat, but 50% independent or non-aligned. And what he ran on is he said people are tired of the entertainment industry. And that people that, Boebert was spending a lot more time and energy on traveling in Trump's orbit and less time on issues that are important to the community.
Interesting.
So whether folks could actually articulate that as well as he did, I think that that's sort of an underlying element of the zeitgeist that people will realize that was the baggage that comes from all the dramatics that we've experienced in the last couple of years.
Well, one of the big winners in the Republicans was Governor DeSantis in Florida. Handily defeated Crist by about 20 percentage points, I think, at the last count. He successfully managed to force the gerrymander of Florida, hoping to have 4 flips in the House. Ended up with 3, but still a pretty good haul for the Republicans. Very popular, rising star, shining star maybe in the Republican Party. I think Trump sensed that a little bit before the election. Actually referred to him in a speech over the weekend as Ron DeSanctimonious, Governor DeSanctimonious, and even today in one of his social media posts said something like, "I'd like to point out that I got over 1 million more votes in 2020 in Florida than DeSantis got last night." And meanwhile, Fox News has completely turned on Trump. I mean, I would say viciously. They basically blaming him for the failure of the red wave and calling DeSantis the new leader of the Republican Party. This is going to be a knife fight.
Yeah, DeSantis winning by 1.5 million votes, approximately, over a formerly Republican challenger. So Charlie Crist used to be a Republican, and this is kind of what I was saying about all politics being local. When the returns first started coming in, Florida. The results there were indicative of something which would have been, if manifested out across the whole country, that would have been a red wave. But Florida is a unique situation in this case. Texas arguably has a similar dynamic because of Governor Abbott. These are 2 national figures who have spent a tremendous amount of time and energy and political capital on national issues, national exposure, sort of rallying the base of right-leaning, conservative-leaning, and arguably Trump-leaning folks. So what we saw in Florida, I think, like you said, I think you hit the nail on the head. This is like a grand slam for DeSantis to a certain extent, however, whatever sports metaphor you want to use. It's validation of his pragmatic approach to politics, because he was proved to be popular among independents and sort of non-aligned folks. I talked to some people in Florida who are, for all social indicators and fiscal indicators, they like Democrats and they like Biden, but the reality is, and this is not to let this be selection bias, but the anecdotally, people just really like DeSantis's matter-of-fact approach to addressing head-on. They like his leadership style, and so that I think played out pretty well. Especially, like I talked about earlier, there's these headwinds, there's the overall dynamic of the features of this election. Just think about this. People, we endured as a country, as a world, COVID and the business closures and the school closures and the vaccine mandates and the mask mandates, and then you add in the cultural factors of curriculum, talk about critical race theory and other things, and whether you agree with actually the positions that he took on these things or not. He contrasted himself sharply and strongly with say, for example, President Biden or other left-leaning folks. So he exhibited leadership, and I think he's the biggest winner overall, besides folks who really just didn't want to see the House and the Senate both go shift sides. That I think is the biggest winner. The ripple is the winner, but DeSantis is a close second.
He also, I think, really benefited from his performance during the hurricane.
Yep.
And one of the things he did was everybody was wondering how he was going to interact with Biden, and he and Biden actually interacted pretty well together. In contrast, I mean, there were little snippets here and there, but he showed that he could be a statesman when quote unquote it counted. Right. I mean, and granted there was stuff afterwards, but you put it off for a day or two, right? You can do that kind of stuff. Whereas I think a lot of people realize Trump would have been incapable of that.
Yeah.
Of doing that, and so to the point of where you might see somebody back in Colorado benefiting from people are tired of the anger industry, whatever, however he said it, that might have been, well, okay, we can have a little bit of Trump, but when it comes down to actually running the country and doing what he needs to do, he'll come out of the role just long enough to be effective.
Yeah, I'd like to agree with you, and then just kind of put my own little spin on it somewhat, in the sense that with responding to that hurricane, it's the right thing to do, and you have to give him credit to cooperate with the president. But Florida is a place where the private insurance industry has, to a certain extent, abandoned people that can afford to insure their properties. The federal system of kind of picking that up is even cost prohibitive in many ways. So this really is an emergency disaster. There was a necessity for DeSantis to eat a little bit of his pride, not eat, but keep it, reserve his pride and his style, because they need the federal bailout, and so that was out of necessity.
No, absolutely.
But let me just say one more thing. He also had New Jersey governor, former Governor Christie, as a role model, who got along really well with President Obama when Superstorm Sandy came in. It's the right thing to do. You need the money.
Christie got ripped for it by Republicans. DeSantis isn't getting ripped for it.
So good point. And then I'll say this too. There is, it's not all like, oh, DeSantis is getting everything right, because for example, the immigration stunts that we've seen. He's got this group of folks that are funding relocating immigrants to own the libs, to show that, hey, you guys are short-sighted on immigration policy. We're just going to put these, we're going to ship immigrants.
And that might have hurt him a little bit, except for the hurricane kind of erased that.
And it didn't hurt him with his own people either. I mean, so if anything, they go, see, this is exactly what we like. He's making a stand. So again, I think his model is right for the moment. He's like you, and you hit the nail on the head. He's like a Trump light when it comes to the theatrics of governance, but he's a smart guy, and he's making calculated choices that best reflect him, but also, as I was saying earlier, the interest of a lot of his constituents, or even people that wouldn't be natural constituents.
All right. Well, we need to move on to the next topic.
In private, you wouldn't expect Lachlan Murdoch, the CEO of Fox, to be a Trump critic, but apparently he is denouncing, or has denounced, the former president in fairly harsh terms this year. I'm told by sources that he has even gone as far as to say, John, that if the president were to, or the former president were to run again for that office, that he believes it would be damaging to the country. Now, that said, Lachlan Murdoch in private has also stressed that the Fox News audience still remains largely supportive of the former president. So I think he knows that he might have his own personal feelings regarding Trump, but that the Fox audience, if the channel were to overtly become critical of the former president, they might dump the channel and flee somewhere else.
All right, for the next topic, and we can talk a little bit about the stuff here, but did young women, and I'm going to crow about this over the next two things, because I've been stressing out over this. Was the Dobbs effect a real thing, or wasn't it? Well, it looks like, it turns out, it was a real thing. And again, I've been a broken record about the Dobbs effect, but it was the fact that every single special election leading up to this, the Democrats had outperformed the polls, and that was because young women, by and large, do not fit into the likely voter formulas that most pollsters have. There were a couple of exceptions, by the way, of pollsters, but everybody was treating them like outliers, and the rest. And I'll be curious to see how the ratings now change at 538 for Trafalgar. We'll talk a little bit about that in the next segment. But the question for this segment is, young women, did they save our butts? Or, for Democrats anyway.
Yeah.
I mean, it's and we had a great conversation about it last night when three of us, older, upper middle age and older men were having a discussion with two young women who fit into this category, 20 something, I assume. It was an interesting discussion, and it does appear that they turned out in big numbers, young people in general, but especially young women.
Yeah. So one of the things that I brought up last night was that, and I'm sorry to keep saying that, it's just a habit, I guess, at this point, but is that, there was a trend here in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, we did not see a lot of young folks voting. So there was this old, back of an envelope estimate that your age group cohort, that approximates voter turnout. So if you're 20, about 20% of the people are going to vote. If you're 40, 60, 80, all the way up, about 80% of 80-year-olds vote. And that's not actually true, but that's like a back of an envelope way of saying this is, young people typically don't vote. However, there's a huge shift in the data that shows that in around 2016, when Trump got elected, young folks started bucking that trend. And this, not to overstate that, but this is where we are. We are at a place now where more young folks are voting, just period. And the observational evidence, like you had pointed out, Eric, that Kansas had a special election, or a primary election over the summer, and about 400,000 people voted only on the amendment that was going to protect their constitutional right to have an abortion. So there was a ballot measure that was going to strike it from the Constitution, but people came out of the woodwork basically to defend it and keep that right maintained in their state constitution. This was not predicted. There's no polling that could predict that. Folks that aren't going to participate, these are considered people that are unlikely to vote. But abortion, the Dobbs decision, the Supreme Court's arguably, earth-shattering change to the set of rights that people come to expect. This is a side effect of that. It really reshaped the country's political landscape. And I could get a little bit deeper into this, but the idea is that abortion was on the ballot in 5 states: Michigan, Vermont, California, Kentucky, and Montana. And while a couple of those states
protected in all of them, right?
Yeah. Yep. So while a couple of those states, it didn't really matter because Vermont and California, the states already had protections in place. They were still, the people still came out. Abortion rights supporters appear, they basically looks like they've swept the board. And just one more nuanced thing here. In Kentucky, which is even more red than Kansas, it's interesting because they were voters who are opposed to abortion actually voted to protect the existing law because they were unhappy with the extreme turn that abortion policy had taken. In Kentucky, they were going to have 0 abortions. And so even people that are against some abortions came out to protect those abortions on behalf of people that they disagree with. So that's a cleavage in the community, in the country, that young people and like you said, women, in many, many cases, it's young women who have come out to make a stand on this issue.
Yeah, no, and definitely, and having a key effect. And one of the things that was confounding people is they weren't voting early. They tend to not vote early. Now, young people tend to not vote early. They tend to wait and either vote on election day or they get their stuff in late. That's just the way the pattern has been. I'm going to discuss a little bit about that in my prediction. But they came out, and as I mentioned last night, there was an instance at Michigan State where you have same-day voting, motor voter registration, whatever. No, sorry, same-day voting registration in Michigan, like we do in California, but you have to register and then go vote. And there was Michigan State had a line where people were waiting 2 hours. It was that long to be able to do that. And these were all students, mostly anyways. I mean, that was amazing. And that was about 2:00 Pacific time when I saw that. And that's when I thought, I think there's going to be quite a few surprises tonight. And certainly in Michigan, there was no red wave in Michigan. I mean, the Gretchen Whitmer one, the Secretary of State, as you mentioned, fought off a challenge from an election denier. I mean, it just went overwhelming. And also the abortion platform issue there. I mean, it just was overwhelming. And yeah, young people and especially young women came out to vote. And I think that the question is whether or not it can be sustained at all. Whether or not organizations are going to figure out, okay, now how do we take this energy and sustain it and invite these young women to be involved in other ways. And maybe they are, there'll probably be a report about that, but I'm looking forward to the reports on the turnout because exit polling is very, iffy. But there would be studies about demographics looking at precincts and the rest. Pew does stuff and the rest, and it'll be very interesting to see, where and when this and how this happened, because this is something that it could be a huge political force for the future if it happens. And there is historical precedent for things like this happening for the long term. When people are brought into a political process, they tend to stay in it. We saw it with the civil rights movement, with the anti-war movement, and the rest. Baby boomers who were involved in those stay. They were one of the most politically involved groups permanently. Even more, and voting even more liberal than the generation behind them, Gen X, so to speak. I mean, so this was a very profound moment. Will it make a difference? Will it turn things around for reproductive rights? It's hard to say, but they very well have preserved it in terms of the courts. And if over the next 2 years, if the Democrats do indeed keep the Senate, the one thing that does allow them to do without any input from the House is pass Biden's judges, to confirm his judge appointments, and that could go a long ways. And especially if something happens to any of the justices on the Supreme Court, that could be a big factor.
And the abortion issue itself is one that like we talked about at length here, is significant for folks in the moment. Young voters participating in increasing amounts, though, that can be more enduring. So one of the things that people had said in the past to explain why young folks don't vote is they're disengaged. I'm going to quote here from an NPR article. They're disengaged, disaffected, and don't believe politics can make a difference in their lives. But at the same time, this is how you do it in our country. And post 2016, we've seen that the gap from the increase in participation of people 18 to 29 who most strongly favor Democrats. I think it's about 55% favor. That they've increased their turnout by 16%. So they went from 20%, 1 in 5, to 36%, which is that's nearly doubling the amount of folks that are participating. And according to a new poll from Institute of Politics at Harvard University, it turns out that the millennials and Gen Z will likely make up the largest voting bloc in the country by 2024. Now, I don't know how accurate that is, but let's just say it's this presidential cycle coming up, or it could be, one or two thereafter. But the point is that issues that are important to young folks might actually be more inspiring and result in more attention paid to things like, for example, this week is COP27, the Conference of Parties for Climate Change. Most people don't follow that too closely, but young folks really do, because the progress that everybody thinks we might have made in that arena, we're not making it. The world is not keeping on track to the types of changes that are deemed to be necessary. I'm just using this as an example, but it's really important to younger folks that a practical, pragmatic, but wide, a larger conversation needs to happen, because these are things that are really important to them.
No, absolutely. And how do Democrats do this? Well, Democrats really do need to, maybe not shut down. I think they've made some real mistakes in completely shutting down the insurgencies of, Bernie Sanders, of course, isn't a young candidate, but he appeals to young people.
Right.
The AOCs, Nancy Pelosi was really, indignant that AOC stepped on her toes and slammed her down. Maybe that was a mistake. It's the Democrats have to make choices as to whether or not they want to win or maintain their power within the party. And sometimes, that's a tough choice.
Yeah, and there's other issues that at play that President Biden and the White House and his administration that they keyed on to try to motivate and inspire young voters, like the student debt relief. Regardless of what you feel about it, that affects younger folks, students in many cases. Also, there was the attention that was paid to issues like What I was going to say is, that any of those issues, that long list of issues that are important to young people, policies were made. Cannabis. That's what I was going to say. Sorry, I was spaced on it. But because I was thinking about Missouri. So cannabis criminal, what's the word? Pardoning. That the pardon of federal cannabis criminals. There you go. Biden sees that as an issue that's important to young people. That issue passed in Missouri. So Missouri had a ballot initiative that was that now it's legalized there, and Missouri is one of those.
That's not a liberal place these days.
Exactly, and Missouri is one of those places where the right is pushing for abortion bans. So there's this ongoing fight. In other words, what I'm getting at here is it's not just this explaining what happened yesterday, but this is going to be an ongoing issue where it's not just culture war issues either. To a certain extent, a lot of these are policy issues.
And that may have been, part of the loan forgiveness motivation for Biden. That was definitely an issue on the minds, and of course, a lot of people our age were like saying we had to pay our loans, and I'm like, maybe some of those of us in the progressive communities can think, well, just because we have to suffer something doesn't mean everybody else has to suffer it. If we can avoid it, somebody else can, and if we embrace that, and maybe think. Maybe we should also be working to make it so that education isn't so expensive that you have to get into this, situation, and maybe also have economies that don't collapse like they've done twice in the past, 15 years, so that you've got better prospects when you do graduate. So it's just. Anyway. Hopefully the Democrats learn from this, because young people, especially young women, it will be my definite theme is they saved the party. Now we'll see the data as it comes out, but they have saved it and kept it close, and I think the Republicans are trembling over it, because they've got to come up with candidates who appeal to them. I just bet you will see DeSantis showing up to at mosh pits and things like that, trying to be hip and the rest. So, all right, well, we'll be talking about that again.
Today, we celebrate the triumph not of a candidate, but of a cause, the cause of democracy.
We are going to raise issues that, historically have not been raised.
What about the nuclear option, doing away with the filibuster? I can tell you that would be the end of the Senate as it was originally devised.
All of this is possible for America. Who was standing in the way? Mitch McConnell.
Where an insurrection that sought to overturn an election, when that failed, the action moved into state capitals.
Okay, finally, related topic. Okay, I've been sort of crowing about for the past 24 hours, the Dobbs effect. I've been, ranting on this show for weeks, and I don't like to gloat, but I'm going to gloat. I was right. Cook's report was wrong. 538 was wrong. About 3/4 of the pollsters were wrong. The Dobbs effect was real. It had an effect yesterday. And the question is why did these pollsters, even with all of these special elections going, having the Democrats overperform, just completely dismiss the Dobbs effect as real, as having anything to do with it? I mean, Nate Silver just brushed it off like it. No, we go with the fundamentals, and it's kind of irresponsible in a way, because I mean, people rely on these reports for political strategy, and also it has an effect on people. People get discouraged. It can have an effect on turnout, especially, unfortunately, progressives more than conservatives actually don't vote when they become discouraged because they think it's hopeless. Not all of us, but some of us, and it does actually depress our participation. We may have had even more votes yesterday if we had analysis that said, you know what, these polls are probably inaccurate based on every single election that's happened so far. And so the question I have is, this is the second time within a year or just over a year, that 538 refused to kind of adjust or its approach to anything. Last year, it was because they don't understand that California now votes much differently than it ever has. And so the turnouts are going to be higher than normal. And even though it was a low turnout, in California compared to 2020, obviously, it's still higher than normal in a lot of places because we can organize to get people out. You can make phone calls, and it's easier to get people to fill out a ballot, put it in an envelope, and drop it in the mail than it is to get them out on election day. It's you've got this, and they bombed in their predictions and their polls and their polling average with the recall election last year. As I pointed out, I think at least twice, their polling average had the recall election failing by like 3 to 6 points, and it ended up losing by 19 points. The polls were all off. The closest poll was over 10 points off. So at what point do we say maybe polls are obsolete? I'm ready to qualify that, because there were some polls that actually I think did try to incorporate, and maybe even successfully did, and maybe 538 has become just too rigid, and Cook's report has become too rigid to be of value anymore.
So
am I being too harsh, as you said last night?
I do think you're being too harsh, but that's in response to it's what's the word? It's the proximity bias. We're so close to an event that just happened that we're evaluating what just happened. So rather than our conclusion being like, oh, these guys are just getting it wrong, totally, we say they're getting it wrong a little, but in fact we know they get it wrong a little all the time, and so that they're gradually making adjustments. And so there's two important things about what you said, and one's more observational and one is actually more technical. Just observationally, I think that you are right in the sense that there's narrative shaping effects. So when we constantly point to the polls and we constantly point to the data, it has a tendency to either make people rely too much on that observation itself, or sort of ignore the fundamentals that are behind it all. And so you kind of let the tail wag the dog. So that's, for example, sometimes the polling trails. So, for example, Fetterman went out there and gave a performance that people say, oh, my goodness, he didn't do very well. This could be trouble. It took a little while for the polling to play out. It would need to take a while because the polling would be about a week behind, so to speak. But in fact, most people, I think, or many people anyway, said, hey, the guy just had a stroke. And even though we don't like exactly what we see, he will recover and we'll give him the benefit of the doubt, et cetera, et cetera. So polling is just a snapshot of a prevailing conventional wisdom about the reality, the fundamental reality on the ground that is a moving target. So narrative, I think we let the tail wag the dog when it comes to polling rather than really analyze the fundamentals, in part because it's easy for journalists, in part because it's a data point we could all point to that seems objective. So that's my piece on that. But here's something more to the point about polling itself, is that I think that a couple of the areas where there's room for improvement, one is the potential likely voter model could be the weak link. And so a lot of these polls, they'll use, for example, if you voted in the last two elections, as a disqualifier entirely. Say if you did not participate in the last two elections, then we're not going to count your vote, or we're going to underweight your vote because you're not a likely voter. So that would remove, for example, new people entering the marketplace of ideas, potentially young people or potentially recently agitated people. So it's not just a bias against young people, it's a bias against people that are joining the process early, maybe for the first time. But so besides that, that's one technical area here. This science is relatively sound. And what I've said before is it's the same sort of mathematics that can predict getting a ball out of a stadium when you hit it with a bat, or getting a satellite up into orbit in space, or a star getting jettisoned from a supernova. Polling itself, the science, the math is sound. It's the implementation, it's the nuance. And so what Nate Silver, in his own defense, what he said, I think at like 4 o'clock in the morning last night, was that there was a gap in between institutional pollsters and partisan pollsters. So, and not to grandstand
Right.
here, but like Trafalgar, for example, it's a Republican-leaning polling operation. Yes. So their numbers are consistently somewhat biased in favor of their position. So,
but he has them rated at A-. I wonder if that's going to change now because they bombed completely this time around.
Exactly. Yeah. And so I'll hand over to you in 1 second. I'll just add this piece of it. What Nate basically said in his own defense, he said, yeah, we're going to re-examine the model because the models themselves adjust for bias over time. 2016 was a slight Democratic bias. 2020 was no bias. 2022 now we know there was a slight Republican bias. So they are changing the underlying metrics of what they're doing. But he said that they might actually be double counting, because when you include Trafalgar, you put their results in their data, you value their data, so you're counting their bias in your numbers, but then you're saying, oh, by the way, there's a bias, and then you're tabulating in the bias, so you're sort of double counting the bias, and I know it's very technical, but what he's basically saying is, yeah, there's room for improvement here.
I got it, but where I really was kind of shocked with them is that there was a discussion about a week before, maybe a week and a half before the election, about all the factors, of the election, and talking about all the predictive stuff, and it was, and they had, and so they're outlining all the stuff. It was like two of them, I guess, wrote the piece, and they go through all of the things, and Nate Silver and somebody else, they go through all the factors as to, inflation. That was the big thing. Then after inflation was, the Biden's approval rating, and then the fundamentals of it being, the first midterm election, blah, blah, blah. And they went through all the factors, and it wasn't like they said, oh, when we did see that there was this Dobbs factor that played out up until September, but we think that has petered out now. They just didn't even discuss it. I mean, it just wasn't even on their radar. And that to me is a fundamental indication that maybe they don't adapt quickly enough. Maybe they don't take a new data in quickly enough to adapt it because they are so tuned in to their what they have that they don't realize that maybe sometimes the world changes a little bit more quickly than they do. Maybe he's too much of a statistician long term. And not enough to understand that sometimes things are earth-shaking that change things. And I remember even hearing George Will. He's saying, well, abortion is never proven, before Dobbs came down, saying, I don't think that's going to be a factor. Abortion is never a serious motivating factor in voting. That's because for a long time, nobody took seriously the possibility that Roe v. Wade would actually be overturned because, the Democrats were always crying wolf. I mean, we thought it was going to happen. Then Souter turned out he actually voted to preserve it, and back in the 90s. And then one after another, it kept getting preserved, and so nobody actually thought it was going to happen. And then when it finally happened, it's like, wow, okay, now all of a sudden more than half of the states do not have reproductive freedom. And not only that, it's going to get worse because there are a lot of draconian laws being put up. Just the idea, and it's like inflation. I think most grown-up people with a high school education understand that inflation is cyclical. It's not going to be here next year, or maybe if it's here next year, it won't be here the year after. It's going to eventually resolve. And yes, it's tough right now, but this is long-term because we've got a bunch of Supreme Court justices there that aren't going to die, and we've got a bunch of gerrymandered, congressmen, and we've got a bunch of states that just are going to pass these laws. I just, I think that Nate Silver just wasn't thinking about it. I don't want to rag on him too much.
Right. But he's the expert.
He's the expert. He should have seen this coming. So, and yet he was completely dismissive of it.
So I'd like to say at first I was going to sort of defend the polling industry just because I know a little bit about it. The back end, so to speak, but I want to give you credit. I believe that you backed into here with you raised two issues, and that by doing that you kind of backed into a really easy explanation here. Is that when it comes to fundamentals, when it comes to qualitative analysis, like what is happening with abortion in the Supreme Court, or the other one that you said, the other major issue that inflation. Inflation's a very sort of technical thing, and conversations about it, people disagree on the qualitatively. Was this transitional, or what's the word, transient, or is it cyclical? And people know that in this case it was not cyclical. This inflation was because of the COVID response, and actually also because of the Federal Reserve's response to the economic crisis of 2008 that's still playing out and creating trillions of dollars out of thin air, not once but twice. But anyway, like you said, people understand that the president can't do a ton when it comes to inflation. So these are qualitative arguments about policy, but polling is quantitative, right? So they have to make a model, and then as far as sticking with it for the duration, well, once they make a model for a cycle, they have to stick with it because of the requirement to keep it scientifically valid. You can't change your methodology midstream. So they create a model, and then they stick with it for the whole cycle. So one of the elements that I recall hearing is that our human bias is that when we hear an October surprise, when something pops up on the screen on our media feeds, and it's like getting closer and closer and closer to the election, we go, oh my God, did you see the Comey letter? Oh my God, and so there's this emotional element of why we think it appears to be so important to us as people, as human beings that are thinking. But the model wants to sort of harmonize that or smooth it out and say, well, it's not that important. Like, even though there's a lot of public opinion changing over this 8, 6, 4, 2 weeks as you lead up to the election, the model tries to smooth all that out. So here's an interesting, this is why I'm agreeing with you here, because 538 actually has two models. They've got one they call, I think, the skinny, and one that they call like the premium or something.
Right.
And the premium includes all the academic, arcane, let's control for this, let's tweak for that, let's smooth everything out, let's be too clever by half, basically. Whereas the skinny model, or I'm sorry if that's not what they call it, but the more simple, streamlined model, they just look at the polling and they say, this is what people are saying. And it turns out, according to Nate himself, he said this time around, that skinny model or that streamlined model was more accurate. And it means that all the fingers on all the dials missed something. And you're right about that.
Yeah, and I just want to point out the polls were all over the place. Like when they say the Georgia polls are accurate, they're not. Nobody's going to be able to say that this time because they were all over the place, all over the map. So it's they back and forth, and I don't envy them and the rest. But Trafalgar is way off. I'm going to be very curious to see. They've got this A- rating. I'm going to be very curious to see where it goes. Amherst College actually favored Republicans even more, and they were way off. And they're rated A, not A-, and the rest. Marist College appears to have been the most accurate that I could see. Targaz Market Research I've never even heard of, but they're going to get really well done because they seem to be right on the mark. Something called Civics, which had B-, I think is probably going to get upgraded this time around because they did right. I'm just I'm going down the Senate polls, the last polls, and how they rated as to the actual results. I guess it flexes in the rest, but the question is Trafalgar, are they deliberately? First of all, I don't necessarily say that they're deliberately doing things in favor of their clients because, quite frankly, if I wanted to be a biased pollster and I wanted to get my team out, I'd have my candidate down by 1 point, right? Right at the end, say, man, we could do it, but God, everybody's got to get out there, right? That would be the optimal, not 10 points ahead because hey, we got it won, right? So but there is a morale aspect to the polling. It does whip people up, and so there and it does depress the other side when polling isn't working, and people say, I don't pay attention to polls, and it's not true. People do, and it's just like they do. All right, that takes us to our predictions. What have you got for us, Dave?
I was trying to decide between two predictions, and one we sort of covered, that DeSantis is doing well. So I don't need to hammer down on how DeSantis is going to compete against Trump. So I'm gonna do a different one that's more predictive, more near term, which is while it's unclear right now what's going to happen in Nevada, no matter what. Either way, the runoff in Georgia is going to be critically important for the balance in the Senate. So the question is, what's going to be the outcome there? And if you remember in the last election cycle, Trump's claim that the election was rigged may have discouraged participation in that special runoff. That dynamic is still at play a little bit, but marginally less so. So the question is, what is going to make people vote? What's going to get folks in Georgia to come out? And I think when, Kemp was popular and Kemp was the incumbent, and Stacey Abrams is a polarizing figure. So without that governor's race in front of folks, people don't have an incentive to go out and say, I'm going to vote against that polarizing figure. So there's a less likelihood, I think, for Republicans to feel the urgency of the Georgia runoff. And so that might end up boding well in Warnock's capacity to win over Walker. And I'm just going to make that prediction that's what plays out, is that these small little differences will work to Warnock's advantage as the incumbent.
All right. I'm going to go local. We had a city council race, John Fullerton and G. Mario Fernandez in my ward, Ward 3. And typically in the old days, the early votes tended to be the most conservative, and the same day voting tended to be more liberal. That's kind of reversed these days because of the politics we've talked about. But the late early votes, the ones that were like in the last days, weekend before, it always tended to break about as liberal, progressive as the same day voting. And those were always counted after the election. That's why progressives always improve afterwards. Watching the past couple elections, that hasn't changed. John Fullerton received 268 votes by mail. For Mario received 284, so about 20 votes behind. He received a lot more on election day, 106 to 57. But I believe that that Mario is going to carry the late-breaking votes, and it probably will carry him over the top, and he will be the next Ward 3 city councilman. So you heard it here. We will find out in a few weeks. But there was also very low turnout so far, 21.60, and that's probably not going to get much higher. Anyway, until next time, stay informed and stay engaged.